When a cocky YouTuber thought he could publicly humiliate Pope Leo XIV in front of millions of viewers, he had no idea he was about to face one of the sharpest theological minds in Vatican history. The digital age had produced many challenges to faith, but none had dared to directly confront the Holy Father himself, until now. The morning sun cast long shadows through the ornate windows of the Vatican's media office as Cardinal Alessandro Toretti placed a tablet on the mahogany desk before Pope Leo XIV. The device displayed a garish thumbnail image, a young man with perfectly styled hair and an arrogant smirk, pointing directly at the camera above bold text reading, "Destroying. Religious delusions live." "Your Holiness," Cardinal Toretti began carefully, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "The invitation came through official channels, but I must advise against this. Jake Martinez has built his following by attacking people of faith. His audience exceeds 12 million subscribers." Pope Leo XIV studied the screen with quiet intensity. At 62, his silver hair framed a face that had seen both the slums of Detroit, where he'd grown up, and the marble halls of Vatican City. His eyes, sharp as ever, reflected neither fear nor anger, only the patient consideration of a man who had spent decades defending truth in hostile environments. 12 million souls, the Pope murmured, his American accent still faintly detectable after years in Rome. How many might hear the gospel who would never set foot in a church? Father Miguel Santos, the youngest member of the Vatican's communications team, shifted nervously near the window. "Holy Father, this isn't traditional media. Martinez specializes in ambush tactics. He'll try to make you look foolish, outdated. His comment sections are brutal." The Pope's lips curved into the slightest smile, not of amusement, but of recognition. He had faced hostile crowds before, from university lecture halls to inner-city community centers where his collar made him an instant target. Something in his expression suggested he saw this not as a threat, but as an opportunity that had been placed deliberately in his path. "Schedule it," he said quietly, closing the tablet, "but make it clear this will be live, unedited, and unscripted." Cardinal Toretti exchanged a worried glance with Father Santos. Neither man fully understood what they had just witnessed in their Pope's eyes, but both sensed they were about to discover something extraordinary about the man they served. 3,000 miles away in a converted warehouse in Los Angeles, Jake "Truth Bomber" Martinez stood before a wall of monitors displaying real-time analytics that would make television executives weep with envy. At 28, he had built an empire on controversy, his perfectly sculpted jawline and calculated outrage generating millions in advertising revenue. Today's numbers were already breaking records, and the stream hadn't even started. "Dude, we're at 2.3 million pre-stream viewers," his producer Danny called from behind a console that looked like mission control. The Vatican announcement broke the internet. Pope v's Truth is trending in 14 countries. Jake adjusted his designer hoodie, carefully chosen to look casual while costing more than most people's rent, and practiced his signature smirk in the ring light's glow. His studio was a temple to modern narcissism. Exposed brick walls covered with neon signs bearing his most viral quotes, multiple camera angles capturing every expression, and a chat feed that moved so fast it resembled digital rainfall. "This is it, boys," Jake announced to his team of 20-somethings who hung on his every word. "We're about to expose the biggest fraud in human history. 2,000 years of manipulation ending tonight." But beneath the bravado, something gnawed at him. His therapist, though he'd never admit to having one publicly, had asked him pointed questions about his crusade against religion. Why did it matter so much? Why the obsession with destroying what others found meaningful? Jake had dismissed the questions then, but they echoed now in the expensive silence between his words. His phone buzzed with a text from his father. "Watching tonight. Proud of you, son." The message should have felt encouraging, but instead it reminded Jake of Sunday mornings long ago, when his family still went to church together, before the divorce, before the bitterness, before Jake learned that prayer. "It couldn't save a broken home. 30 seconds to live," Danny announced. Jake straightened, pushing down the unwelcome memories. He had built his identity on being the fearless truth-teller, the man who said what others were afraid to say. His audience loved him for his ruthless takedowns of religious figures who couldn't match his quick wit or social media savvy. But Pope Leo XIII wasn't some small-town preacher or televangelist. This was different. The red recording light blinked on, and Jake's practiced smile emerged like a mask sliding into place. He had no idea he was about to encounter someone who could see right through it. The split screen appeared at exactly 8 p.m. Eastern, dividing the world's attention between two vastly different realms. On the right, Jake Martinez sat in his neon-lit studio fortress, ring lights casting sharp shadows across his angular features. On the left, Pope Leo XIV appeared from a simple Vatican office, the warm glow of a desk lamp revealing centuries-old books behind him and a small crucifix on the wall. "Holy Father," Jake began with practiced smoothness, his voice carrying just enough reverence to seem respectful while his eyes betrayed something else entirely. "Thank you for joining us tonight. I have to say, when my team reached out, we never expected the Vatican to actually respond." Pope Leo XIV's smile was gentle but knowing, as if he could already see through the carefully constructed facade. "Jake, isn't it? Thank you for having me. I understand you have quite a following." The chat exploded with reactions in dozens of languages. Viewer counts climbed past 4 million as notifications pinged across social media platforms worldwide. In university dorms, coffee shops, and living rooms from Seoul to Stockholm, people leaned closer to their screens, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented. 4.2 million and climbing, Jake announced with obvious pride, gesturing toward his wall of monitors. "That's probably more people than have heard a papal address in person throughout all of history combined." "Welcome to the digital age, Your Holiness." "Remarkable," the Pope replied thoughtfully, "though I suspect the message matters more than the medium, don't you think?" Something flickered across Jake's expression, the briefest hesitation before. His confident mask reasserted itself. "Well, that's exactly what we're here to discuss. I mean, you represent an institution that's been delivering the same message for 2 millennia. Don't you think it's time for an update?" The Pope's eyes never left Jake's face, and there was something unsettling about the complete absence of defensiveness in his demeanor. Most religious leaders Jake interviewed became flustered or angry within minutes. This man seemed almost prepared. "Truth doesn't need updating," Pope Leo XIV said quietly, "though perhaps our understanding of it can deepen." Jake leaned forward, slightly, recognizing an opening. The chat stream accelerated, viewers sensing the first real exchange of what promised to be an epic confrontation. Across the globe, people held their breath, some praying, others anticipating intellectual bloodsport. Neither man knew that millions were about to witness something that would fundamentally change how they viewed faith, reason, and the dangerous game of public humiliation. The viewer count hit 5.2 million as Jake's confidence visibly swelled. He leaned back in his chair with the calculated casualness of a predator sizing up prey, his fingers drumming against his desk in a rhythm that betrayed his eagerness to begin the real attack. "Let's dive right in, Your Holiness," Jake said, his tone shifting from respectful to patronizing with surgical precision. "You lead an organization that asks people to believe in talking snakes, virgin births, and dead people coming back to life. In 2025, with everything we know about science and psychology, how do you justify promoting what are essentially ancient fairy tales. The chat erupted with fire emojis and laughing faces, but also with angry responses from believers worldwide. Jake's moderators worked frantically to keep the comment stream from descending into complete chaos. Pope Leo XIV's expression remained unchanged, as if he'd been asked about the weather. "I notice you're grouping together very different types of literature and claims, Jake. That's usually the first sign that someone hasn't seriously engaged with what they're criticizing." Jake's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. This wasn't the flustered defensive response he'd expected. "Come on, Your Holiness. Miraculous events that violate the laws of physics? You have to admit that sounds pretty far-fetched to any rational person." "Which laws of physics?" the Pope asked with genuine curiosity. "Are you referring to the same physics that tells us 95% of the universe consists of dark matter and dark energy that we can't detect or understand? The same science that suggests multiple dimensions we can't perceive and quantum events that seem to violate causality?" A noticeable pause followed. Jake's production team exchanged glances behind the cameras. This wasn't going according to script. That's different," Jake stammered slightly before recovering. "Those are scientific theories based on evidence and mathematical models." "Indeed," Pope Leo XIV nodded. "Evidence and reasoning, the same tools the Church has used for centuries to examine claims of miraculous events. We don't just accept stories blindly, Jake. We investigate them as rigorously as any scientist." Jake's jaw clenched as he realized his opening gambit had not only failed but been turned against him. The chat stream showed a noticeable shift. Fewer mocking emojis, more thoughtful questions. His audience was actually listening to this man instead of waiting for Jake to deliver the knockout punch. "Interesting deflection," Jake said, his voice carrying the first hint of real hostility. "But you still haven't explained why intelligent people should believe in supernatural fairy tales." The Pope's eyes sparkled with something that might have been amusement, as if Jake had just walked directly into a carefully laid trap. The veneer of professional courtesy finally began to crack as Jake's frustration mounted. His subscriber count was climbing past 6 million, but the comments weren't delivering the validation he craved. Instead of his usual chorus of supporters cheering his intellectual dominance, the chat showed something unprecedented. People actually defending the Pope's responses. "Let's talk about your personal life, Your Holiness," Jake said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "You've committed to celibacy, right? No wife, no children, no intimate relationships. Don't you think that's fundamentally unnatural? I mean, you're asking people to suppress basic human drives." The shift in tone was jarring. Across the globe, viewers recoiled from their screens. In a small apartment in Manila, Maria Santos whispered to her teenage daughter, "This isn't right. He's being cruel." In a London pub, conversation stopped as patrons watched the American YouTuber cross lines that even his harshest critics hadn't expected. Pope Leo XIV's expression remained serene, but something deeper flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but a profound sadness for the young man sitting across the digital divide. "Jake, every meaningful commitment requires sacrifice. Marriage requires sacrifice too. The question isn't whether we sacrifice, but what we sacrifice for." "That's a non-answer," Jake shot back, his carefully styled persona giving way to something uglier. "You've basically neutered yourself for an imaginary sky daddy. How do you sleep at night, knowing you've wasted your one life pretending to serve a delusion?" The chat exploded with shocked reactions. Even Jake's most devoted followers began posting messages of discomfort. "Bro, too far," appeared repeatedly in the stream. His production team looked visibly uncomfortable behind the cameras. But Jake, sensing his intellectual arguments failing, doubled down on cruelty. "I'm serious, Your Holiness. You've convinced millions of people to waste their lives, their money, their critical thinking skills on Bronze Age mythology. Don't you feel any guilt about being essentially a professional con artist? The words hung in the digital air like poison. In Vatican City, Cardinal Toretti watched from the media office, his hands clenched in prayer. Around the world, believers and non-believers alike felt the same sickening sensation. They were witnessing something cross from debate into deliberate humiliation. Pope Leo XIV sat quietly for a moment, his hands folded, his breathing steady. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to reach through the screen and touch something profound in every listener. "Jake," he said softly, "I want you to know that I'm praying for you right now." The simple statement landed like a thunderbolt, and Jake's face flushed with sudden, inexplicable rage. The viewer count hit 7.8 million as Jake's composure completely shattered. The simple words, "I'm praying for you," had triggered something primal and ugly, stripping away years of carefully crafted intellectual persona to reveal the wounded, angry young man beneath. "Praying for me?" Jake's voice cracked with bitter laughter. "To who exactly? Your magical carpenter who supposedly walked on water?" He leaned forward, his eyes wild with the kind of desperate fury that comes from feeling cornered. "Let me tell you what I think about your precious Jesus Christ, your holiness." The chat stream slowed to a crawl as millions held their breath. Even Jake's most anti-religious followers sensed something terrible approaching. Your boy Jesus, if he even existed, was probably just another delusional street preacher who got himself killed for causing trouble. The resurrection, mass hallucination, the miracles, parlor tricks that impressed Bronze Age peasants. Jake's voice grew more venomous with each word. "And your precious Virgin Mary. Come on, we all know what really happened there. Some teenage girl got pregnant out of wedlock and made up a ghost story to avoid getting stoned to death." The silence that followed was deafening. Across the globe, even atheists and agnostics recoiled from their screens. In homes where faith had never taken root, parents found themselves reaching for remote controls, uncomfortable, exposing their children to such naked hatred. The cruelty wasn't intellectual, it was visceral, designed to wound and humiliate. Danny, Jake's producer, frantically gestured from behind the cameras, trying to signal his boss to pull back. The chat had transformed from excitement to horror. Subscribers were actively leaving in real time, the first time Jake had ever watched his follower count drop during a live stream. But Jake had passed the point of rational calculation. Years of suppressed anger at childhood prayers that went unanswered, at a God who had seemingly abandoned his family when they needed him most, came pouring out in a torrent of blasphemy that shocked even him. "So tell me, Pope Leo XIV," he sneered, using the title like a curse word, "how does it feel to be the CEO of the world's longest-running fairy tale? Do you actually believe this garbage, or are you just in it for the tax-free lifestyle and the Golden Palace?" Pope Leo XIV sat in perfect stillness, his hands still folded, his expression unchanged. But something had shifted in his eyes, a transformation from gentle patience to something far more profound and powerful. The world was about to discover what happens when unlimited grace meets unlimited arrogance. When Pope Leo XIV finally spoke, his voice carried authority that seemed to reach through the screen and grasp viewers by the soul. The gentle parish priest was gone, replaced by something far more formidable, a brilliant mind that had been holding back, waiting for exactly this moment. "Jake," he said, and somehow the simple use of his name felt like a scalpel finding its mark. "I want to thank you for that display. You've just provided the perfect demonstration of why the world needs Christ more than ever." The chat stream, which had been moving so fast it was unreadable, suddenly slowed as millions of viewers sensed a fundamental shift in the dynamic. Jake's smirk faltered as he realized something had changed in the Pope's demeanor. The patient, Tolerance had been replaced by surgical precision. Throughout this conversation, you've positioned yourself as the rational, enlightened one, Pope Leo XIV continued, his voice steady but carrying new weight. Yet everything you've just said reveals a profound ignorance of history, philosophy, theology, and basic logic. Let me help you understand what you've actually accomplished here tonight. Jake opened his mouth to interrupt, but something in the Pope's bearing made him hesitate. For the first time since the stream began, he looked uncertain. You claim to champion reason, yet you've spent the last hour using logical fallacies that any first-year philosophy student would recognize. You've employed ad hominem attacks, straw-man arguments, and appeals to ridicule while avoiding substantive engagement with actual Christian thought. The Pope's words came with the precision of a master surgeon. This isn't intellectual discourse, Jake. It's performance art, masquerading as rationality. Across the globe, viewers leaned forward. In universities and coffee shops, in homes and offices, people who had been watching casual entertainment suddenly realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. The humble man of faith was revealing himself to be an intellectual force that Jake had never anticipated. You mock beliefs. You clearly don't understand, Pope Leo XIV continued, his eyes never leaving Jake's increasingly pale face. You ridicule texts you've apparently never studied. You dismiss philosophical arguments you've never seriously considered. This isn't skepticism, Jake. It's willful ignorance wrapped in arrogant posturing. Jake's production team exchanged panicked glances. The confident young man who had begun the evening as the hunter had somehow become the hunted, and he didn't even seem to understand how it had happened. But we're just getting started, the Pope said with devastating gentleness. Shall we discuss what actual evidence and reasoning reveal about your worldview? Pope Leo XIV leaned forward slightly, and the simple movement somehow commanded the attention of nearly 8 million viewers worldwide. What followed was not a religious sermon, but an intellectual dismantling so methodical and devastating that even Jake's most devoted followers found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. Let's examine your materialist worldview. Jake, the Pope began with clinical precision. You believe consciousness emerged from unconscious matter through purely random processes. Tell me, if your thoughts are merely chemical reactions determined by prior physical causes, why should anyone trust anything you say? You're essentially claiming to be a biological robot programmed by mindless forces, yet expecting us to treat your opinions as rational insights. Jake's mouth opened, but no words came. The question had struck at the very foundation of his entire intellectual framework. Furthermore, Pope Leo XIV continued relentlessly, you ridicule the idea of objective moral truth, yet you've spent this entire evening making moral judgments, calling beliefs harmful, institutions corrupt, and behaviors wrong. In your worldview, where do these moral standards come from? If we're just evolved animals, why shouldn't the strong exploit the weak? Why shouldn't might make right? The chat stream had transformed completely. Where once there had been laughing emojis and mocking comments, now there were thinking faces and profound questions. Viewers were no longer watching entertainment. They were witnessing a mind being systematically deconstructed. But perhaps most tellingly, the Pope pressed on, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent in the world's greatest libraries and lecture halls, you demand evidence for God while accepting without question far more extraordinary claims. You believe the universe created itself from nothing, violating every principle of causation we observe. You believe life spontaneously generated from non-life, despite no laboratory ever reproducing this miracle. You believe consciousness emerged from matter, though no materialist can explain how this is even theoretically possible. Jake's confident posture had collapsed entirely. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the studio's air conditioning. His Production team watched in stunned silence as their star fell apart in real time. Your faith, Jake, requires believing in far more miracles than Christianity ever has, Pope Leo XIV concluded with devastating gentleness. The difference is that you refuse to acknowledge your beliefs as faith, preferring to call them science. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for his water bottle, his entire identity crumbling before millions of witnesses. The hunter had become the prey, and the trap was still closing. Jake made one final desperate attempt to regain control. His voice, cracking with barely contained panic. "You can dress it up with philosophy all you want," he said, his earlier swagger replaced by the shrill desperation of a cornered animal. "But at the end of the day, you're still a grown man who believes in magic stories written by primitive goat herders." The insult hung in the digital air like a toxic cloud. 8.3 million viewers held their breath, witnessing what felt like a man's soul being laid bare in its ugliest form. Even Jake's most ardent supporters cringed at the crude attack on billions of believers worldwide. Pope Leo XIV stood slowly from his chair, the simple movement commanding such immediate attention that the global audience seemed to lean forward. And collectively, when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet power of absolute moral authority. "Jake," he said, looking directly through the camera as if addressing a wounded son, "I want to thank you. You've just demonstrated perfectly why the world needs the gospel more than ever." The shift was palpable. Something fundamental had changed in the Pope's bearing. Not anger, not condescension, but a profound sadness mixed with unshakable love. "Throughout this conversation, I've treated you with respect despite your hostility. I've answered your questions thoughtfully despite your mockery. I've shown you patience despite your cruelty. Do you know why?" The studio fell into cathedral. Silence. "Because my faith taught me to love my enemies and pray for those who persecute me." Jake's face went ashen as the weight of his own behavior crashed over him. "Your worldview has no such requirement," Pope Leo XIV continued with devastating gentleness. "In fact, it has given you permission to treat anyone who disagrees with you as subhuman, primitive goat herders, as you so eloquently put it. This is the fruit of your enlightened secular morality, contempt disguised as sophistication, cruelty masquerading as intelligence." The global audience watched in stunned recognition as the Pope's words cut through years of cultural conditioning. "You've proven tonight that without God, people become exactly what you've become: proud, harsh, and empty. The very capacity for love and moral reasoning that you've spent this evening attacking is what makes this conversation possible. You've been arguing against the very foundation that gives your arguments meaning." Jake sat speechless, his entire intellectual empire reduced to rubble by grace, wisdom, and unshakable moral authority. The hunter had been utterly, completely defeated, not by force, but by love. The live stream ended in suffocating silence. For several seconds, Jake stared at his blank screen, where Pope Leo XIII's face had been moments before, his mouth slightly open, his confident facade shattered like glass on concrete. The red recording light still blinked, capturing every moment of his complete psychological collapse for posterity. We need to cut the stream," Danny whispered from behind the console, his voice barely audible in the cavernous studio that suddenly felt like a tomb. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for his mouse, but he couldn't seem to make his fingers work. The chat continued scrolling past, not with the usual celebration of another destroyed religious figure, but with something far more unsettling. Messages of genuine concern, philosophical questions he'd never considered, and most damning of all, former followers expressing newfound respect for the man Jake had tried to humiliate. "Dude, are you okay?" Danny approached cautiously, as if approaching a wounded animal. The 20-something production team that had looked up to Jake as their intellectual hero now stared at him with confusion and something approaching pity. Jake finally managed to end the stream, But the damage was done. The viewer count had peaked at 8.7 million, his largest audience ever, but they had witnessed his complete intellectual and moral destruction. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, each one feeling like another nail in his coffin. "That wasn't supposed to happen," Jake mumbled, his voice hollow. The perfectly styled hair was disheveled now, his designer hoodie wrinkled with nervous sweat. He was supposed to be just another religious fanatic. They always crack under pressure. But even as he spoke the words, Jake knew they rang false. Pope Leo XIV hadn't cracked. He had revealed Jake to be everything the YouTuber had accused religious people of being: close-minded, arrogant, and intellectually dishonest. Sarah, his social media manager, looked up from her laptop with wide eyes. "Jake, the comments, they're not what we expected. People are saying—" She paused, struggling to find words. "They're saying the Pope won, decisively." The magnitude of what had just occurred began settling over the studio like a heavy blanket. Jake Truth Bomber Martinez, destroyer of faith, had been systematically dismantled by the very man he'd sought to mock. And 8 million people had watched it happen in real time. In the crushing silence that followed, Jake finally understood what true humiliation felt like. Within minutes of the stream ending, the digital world erupted. Across 6 continents, in languages from Mandarin to Spanish to Arabic, the same conversation was happening. Had they really just witnessed one of the most devastating intellectual defeats in internet history? In a cramped Tokyo apartment, university student Hiroshi Tanaka sat stunned before his laptop. He had tuned in, expecting to see another arrogant religious leader get demolished by Jake's razor-sharp wit. Instead, he found himself questioning everything he'd believed about faith and reason. "I need to read some philosophy," he whispered to his empty room, reaching for books he'd ignored for years. Half a world away in London, Professor Margaret Whitfield watched the clips spreading across academic Twitter with growing amazement. A renowned atheist philosopher herself, she found herself typing what she never thought she would. Regardless of one's religious views, Pope Leo XIV just delivered a masterclass in philosophical argumentation. The man is clearly brilliant. The hashtag #PopeVsTruth exploded across social media platforms, but not in the way Jake's team had expected. Instead of celebrating another religious takedown, users were sharing clips of the Pope's responses with captions like, "This changed everything, and I've never heard faith defended like this." In a small church in rural Alabama, Father Michael Chen watched his phone buzz with messages from parishioners who had been drifting away from faith. "Father, did you see what happened? Tonight," read text after text. "Maybe we should talk." Even Jake's most loyal followers found themselves in crisis. Reddit forums that typically mocked religious belief were filled with confused posts. "I've followed Truth Bomber for 3 years, but that Pope just destroyed every argument I thought was bulletproof." The reaction wasn't universally positive. Hardcore atheist communities raged against what they saw as intellectual sleight of hand. "The Pope used philosophy to confuse people," one angry blogger wrote. "Don't let pretty words fool you. Religion is still delusion." But even these defensive responses felt hollow compared to the quiet power they had witnessed. In news stations around the globe, producers scrambled to make sense of what had occurred. How do you report on a live stream that had somehow become a philosophical earthquake? The story wasn't just about a debate, it was about millions of people suddenly questioning assumptions they'd held for years. By dawn, Pope Leo was trending in 47 countries, and the Vatican's phone lines were overwhelmed with interview requests. The humble man who had entered a digital lion's den had emerged not just victorious, but transformative. 3 weeks later, Pope Leo XIV stood at the window of his private study, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across St. Peter's Square. The same gentle light that had illuminated his desk during that fateful live stream now revealed something extraordinary below. Thousands of pilgrims, many holding signs that read, "Thank you for defending truth, and you changed my life." The scene before him was unprecedented in his papacy. Where once tourists had wandered with casual interest, now genuine seekers gathered in prayer circles, some holding laptops and phones, sharing clips from that night with friends and family. Many wore the distinctive hoodies and graphic tees that marked them as part of Jake's former audience, digital natives who had never set foot in a church until 3 weeks ago. Cardinal Toretti entered quietly, carrying a leather folder thick with correspondence. "Your Holiness, the final numbers are in. Seminary applications are up 400% worldwide. Conversion inquiries have increased by 600%. The Vatican website crashed twice this week from traffic. And this..." He placed a letter on the Pope's desk. This came from Jake Martinez himself. Pope Leo XIV picked up the handwritten letter, noting the careful script of someone unaccustomed to writing by hand. The pages trembled slightly in his weathered fingers as he read words that revealed a soul in transformation. Apologies written and rewritten, philosophical questions that showed genuine searching and a humility that would have been unimaginable 3 weeks ago. "He's enrolled in a philosophy program at Notre Dame," the Pope said quietly, "and he's asking if we might correspond about faith and reason. He wants to understand how he was so wrong about everything." The irony wasn't lost on either man. The young atheist who had mocked Bronze Age goat herders was now seeking wisdom from the very texts he'd once ridiculed. Cardinal Toretti smiled, pulling more documents from his folder. "There's more. Do you remember Professor Whitfield from Oxford? The atheist philosopher who defended your arguments on social media?" "Margaret Whitfield, yes. Brilliant woman. She's requested a private audience. She says she has questions that only began that night, and she can't find adequate answers in secular philosophy." The Cardinal's voice carried wonder. "Your Holiness, we're receiving similar requests from intellectuals, scientists, and former skeptics around the world. That one conversation has become the most watched religious content in internet history, over 50 million views and counting across all platforms." Pope Leo XIV moved to his desk where a small stack of letters waited, personal testimonies from viewers whose lives had been transformed. A physics professor from MIT who had rediscovered faith after years of militant atheism, writing that he'd finally found answers to questions that had haunted him since graduate school. A young mother from Sweden who had started attending Mass with her children, explaining that she'd seen real wisdom defended with real love for the first time. A retired journalist from Australia who was writing a book about the encounter, titled "When Wisdom Meets Pride, the Night Faith Won the Internet." "The strangest part," Cardinal Toretti continued, opening another file filled with academic correspondence, "is how it's being studied in universities. Philosophy departments are using it as a case study in argumentation. Harvard's debate team analyzes it for technique. Princeton's philosophy department has created an entire semester course around that single conversation. Even secular institutions like Berkeley acknowledge it as a masterclass in intellectual discourse." Through the window, Pope Leo XIV watched a group of young people, clearly former Jake Martinez followers based on their appearance and faded Truth Bomber merchandise, kneeling in prayer before St. Peter's Basilica. Some held rosaries with the awkward grip of beginners, fingers fumbling over beads they'd never touched before. Others simply sat in contemplative silence, wrestling with questions they'd never allowed themselves to ask, their faces showing the particular exhaustion that comes from having one's entire worldview transformed overnight. "The media keeps asking for interviews," Cardinal Toretti added, flipping through pages of requests. "Every major network wants to understand how you did it. CNN, BBC, even Joe Rogan's people have called. They're calling it the most important religious moment of the digital age. Pope Leo XIV smiled gently, his eyes still fixed on the pilgrims below. I simply spoke truth with love, Alessandro. Jake did most of the work himself. His own arguments revealed their contradictions when exposed to gentle questioning. Pride always contains the seeds of its own destruction. I merely provided the soil for them to sprout. A young woman below caught his attention. She was showing something on her phone to an elderly Italian man, both of them nodding earnestly. The Pope recognized the gesture. She was sharing clips from the live stream, probably translating Jake's questions and his responses. The digital encounter had become evangelization itself. Jake thought he was exposing the weakness of faith, the Pope mused, his voice carrying both sadness and triumph. Instead, he revealed its strength. He believed he was demonstrating the superiority of secular reason. Instead, he showed its limitations when divorced from wisdom and humility. He turned to Cardinal Toretti with eyes that sparkled with the same quiet confidence that had devastated a digital empire. God truly does work in mysterious ways. A soft knock interrupted their reflection. Father Santos appeared in the doorway, his expression mixing excitement with nervousness. Your Holiness, there's a young man here to see you. He says he's driven from Los Angeles, 36 hours straight, barely stopping for gas. He's been waiting since dawn in the square, refusing to leave until he speaks with you personally. Pope Leo XIV and Cardinal Toretti exchanged knowing glances. They both suspected who it might be. The same young man who had attempted to destroy faith in front of millions had somehow found his way to the Vatican's doorstep, seeking the very thing he'd once mocked. Send him in, the Pope said gently, straightening his simple white cassock and moving away from the window. And Father Santos, have some coffee prepared, the good beans from Colombia. Something tells me this will be a very long conversation indeed, and the young man has traveled far to get here. As footsteps approached in the corridor, hesitant, almost fearful, nothing like the confident swagger that had begun that live stream, Pope Leo XIV prepared to meet the young man who had unknowingly helped him reach millions of souls in a single evening. The hunter had become the seeker, and grace was about to complete its perfect work.